Welcome everyone to our very, very exciting panel. Before we start, let me welcome you to the Virtual Games Institute. The Games Institute is one of 8 university-level institutes, centers and institutes at the University of Waterloo. What that means is that we do not fall under any particular faculty at the university. We work across all of them. And I am really, really happy that I am able to say that the Games Institute is probably one of the most cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary centers at Waterloo, and probably elsewhere as well. We have membership in graduate students and faculty from all 6 faculties and a really, really large number of departments as well. Today is no different. We have folks here on the panel who are representing different departments at the university, and so we very much keep the ethos and the mission of the Games Institute at inter and cross-disciplinary research. And for us, it's not just a software and a hardware engineer working together, which is very much interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. We are talking about collaboration between faculty lines. So say a social scientist working with an engineer, or a computer scientist working with a person from the humanities. So that is not quite what will be happening today at this very panel. However, the underlying issues that will be discussed today are pointing to some of the need for cross and interdisciplinary and inter-industry discussions and discourse, and so I hope that the panelists will hit on some of that as well. If you are on campus, we are located in East Campus 1, so close by, and right now, unfortunately, the facility is closed to public access because of the pandemic restrictions, but we're hoping that in the winter time and into spring and summer next year, we'll be actually welcome to welcome guests as well. We'll be able to welcome guests at the GI as well. And with that, I will let our co-hosts for today, the Women's Center, take over and introduce the panel and the panelists, and proceed with our territorial acknowledgement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So my name is Joya Myers, and I'm the Advocacy Director at the Women's Center, and I'm going to be the MC for today. I'd like to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. The Women's Center acknowledges that our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. We would like to speak a bit more about how the colonization of Indigenous nations resonates with Love Your Body Week, which is the week that this event is part of. The policing of Indigenous bodies, in particular women, queer, and Two-Spirit folks, has been a tool of colonization. From government laws and policies to imperialistic and capitalistic messaging that teaches us only one standard of beauty, Indigenous people have been devalued and erased. Our hope through this campaign is to challenge and unlearn some of those toxic beauty standards and embrace ourselves. One week of celebration every year cannot, however, undo hundreds of years of colonial conditioning. So we encourage you to keep educating yourselves and challenging colonial norms, no matter how small, in your daily lives moving forward. And so next, I'd also like to issue a brief trigger warning before we start the conversation, as it may contain subjects that are difficult to some. So if at any point during the conversation you feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable due to any mention of sensitive topics, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being and step out of the conversation as required. So with those in mind, we will be going through some questions today about the representation of women and queer bodies in video games, as well as the general gaming community culture around women and queer people. And starting off, I'd like to introduce our panelists, or have them introduce themselves, starting with Lindsay Meaning.
Oh, I get to go first. Hello. My name is Lindsay Meaning. I'm a PhD candidate in the English department here at University of Waterloo. I'm in my 4th year. I've come to the study of women in games through a sort of circuitous route. My past research was looking at representations of settler colonialism and imperialism in single-player role-playing games. But I continue in this work, I was more and more interested in the connections between colonial power and the sexual exploitation and abuse of Indigenous women in colonized territories, and the way that this historical reality was reflected in the globalization of the contemporary sex industry. So now my current focus has shifted, and I am looking at representations of the sex industry in video games. I'm looking at narratives of agency and mechanics of objectification and the sexual exploitation, objectification of women in games generally. So that's where I'm at, and this this area is quite new for me. Only a few months new, but it's been a passion for a long time. So I hope I can contribute something to this panel.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Bree, would you like to go next?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Brianna Weens. I'm a lecturer and a postdoctoral researcher in communication arts here at the University of Waterloo. So my research is concerned with how digital feminist artifacts, ideas, and stories are moving through different contexts, both online and offline, specifically within the context of networked social movements, but how these are always constrained and enabled by different forms of power. So alongside Shanna, I run the digital archive Feminist Stew Media, which is at Aesthetic Resistance on Instagram, out of the feminist think tank here at the Games Institute. And we are a research group that's really committed to intervening into racism, misogyny, and queerphobia across different mediated platforms, but also in the academy and, of course, in daily life. So I'll leave it there.
Great. And finally, Shanna.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shanna McDonald. I'm an associate professor in the Communication Arts Department. I co-run Feminist Think Tank with Bree. And to build on that, I think some of the things that we're trying to do currently with the research group are to try and figure out some humanity-centered ways of dealing with and thinking through digital culture. That includes thinking in particular about how we make digital culture, how we preserve digital culture, and how we mobilize it in public spaces. At the core of all this work is us thinking through, in particular, activist practices and how we push back against the types of online hate and misogyny that basically structure our digital lives. And so we're trying to think of ways to actively push back against that, as Bree said, in all aspects of scholarship, life, and all of that.
Great. So as you can see, we have a panel of experts on digital communities and gaming representation. So next we're going to have Dr. Emma Vossen introduce herself and give us some historical context on the treatment of women and queer people in gaming.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Emma Vossen, and I've been asked to just give a short little bit of context today around I guess like both the historical and contemporary context around misogyny in gaming. That's largely what my PhD research and my research since then has focused on. I looked a lot at issues of access in games culture. So, you know, who is welcome in those spaces, who is hailed to those spaces, that sort of thing. And a lot of my research has also looked at issues of harassment and online harassment in games and on social media. I didn't intend to research that, but as I was doing the other research, I was being harassed more and more. So the harassment sort of research became part of my games research, and that's how I came about that. So I have some slides or some images that I'm just going to share really quick. Can everyone see that? Looks good?
Yeah.
Okay. So in this quick talk, I'm going to give a glimpse into 20 stories through images that I've collected that I hope will give you a sense of the shape and context of misogyny in gaming for our discussion today, and maybe hope inspire some questions as well. I could talk for hours about each of these images, but I'm going to try to keep it around 5 minutes today. So I want to start in 1903 with Elizabeth Maggie Phillips, who created and patented the landlord's game, which you now know as Monopoly. It was an explicitly anti-capitalist game about issues surrounding monopolies, but the idea was stolen by a man who then sold his version of Parker Brothers and made a lot of money off of it. It seemed like a good place to start with a woman who was trying to make a difference with her game design, only to watch a man get all the credit and capital for her work. We all know that the contributions of women are often forgotten when history is recorded, and this was the case with the women who were hired to be computers, i.e. women who could calculate ballistic trajectories during the Second World War. And even with 100 women doing this work, it wasn't enough. So the ENIAC, one of the world's first programmable computers, was created. It was programmed by a team of 6 women to basically perform the calculations that they had previously done themselves. The computer was a huge success, but the US military took full credit for it, not mentioning the women who did the work. These women were the first professional programmers and the first teachers of programming, but their presence in history was not recorded. Later, historians who saw them in photos simply thought that they were refrigerator ladies, i.e. women who were models who would pose with electronics and appliances in catalogs and advertisements and that sort of thing. In the 1980s, women who played and even women who wrote parts of Dungeons and Dragons were similarly overlooked and treated poorly. In 1980, in an issue of Dragon magazine, 2 women penned an article entitled "Women Want Equality and Why Not?", arguing that women who played these games had to cope with discrimination and prejudice. The article points out many of the same issues that are still present in games culture today. Sierra Entertainment, known for its adventure games, was founded in 1979 by Roberta and Ken Williams, a husband and wife team. The company was notable for having many women fans and employees, as you can see in this company photo. Here you can see Sierra designer Lori Cole describe a bit of hate mail they received for having a female character in their game in the early 80s, calling them feminists. This anecdote would be funny in retrospect if it wasn't so typical and almost exactly the same as the hate that women developers still have to deal with today. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there was a shift to focusing on the male player more explicitly than ever before. A lot of game advertising and marketing focused not just on boys and men, but actually on the phallus itself. Advertisements include a lot of references to genitals in this time, or actually to masturbation, as you can see here. A lot of advertising from this time and into the early 2000s was also focused on how women and sex were a distraction from games. And this type of marketing really emphasized a dynamic that was sort of women versus gamers, right? And it solidified the idea in the collective unconscious that women not only didn't enjoy games, but actively hated them because they were taking men away from them. This stereotype led to a lot of pushback throughout the 2010s from women gamers. One notable and popular example of this was the group Team Unicorn, who produced parody songs such as Geek and Gamer Girls. These screenshots are from that video here, which was a spoof of Katy Perry's California Girls. The group's name, Team Unicorn, was a play on the joke that girls who liked games or other nerdy things were unicorns, i.e. they did not exist. One of the funny things about this video is a lot of people did not believe that the women in the video actually did like the things they were singing about because they were considered too beautiful to like games or comics or other things. In 2012, feminist media critic Anita Sarkeesian launched a Kickstarter for the video series Tropes versus Women in Video Games. She received nearly $160,000, although she only asked for $6,000. From this point forward, Sarkeesian dealt with ample harassment, including death threats from those who were angry about her examining these games and making this series, and also, angry about feminist critiques of video games in general. Here you can see some examples of the harassment that Sarkeesian was still facing daily in 2015, which was years after the Kickstarter first went live. Then in 2014, game developer Zoe Quinn's abusive ex-boyfriend posted a manifesto of close to 10,000 words online detailing what he perceived as Quinn's wrongdoings. He purposely wrote and workshopped the post in a way that would make it go viral in places that were already incredibly biased against women and feminism. This was the spark that eventually became Gamergate, which I'm sure you all know about. Quinn faced years of harassment and death threats, and the movement targeted any person who was critiquing or creating games from a progressive perspective. This included games journalists, academics, streamers, developers, and so on. Around 2016, we see the merging of games-based harassment with white supremacist harassment. So there's a rallying around Donald Trump, Milo Yiannopoulos, Steve Bannon, and other alt-right figures who were not involved in the gaming community. But they really wanted to take advantage of that sort of energy and hatred and intensity that they saw there. And it was around this time that the harassment got much worse for me personally as a grad student at the time. And this is a very, very small selection of some of the harassment that I received around that time. By this point, the harassers had become a lot more clever about how they issued death threats. So you would get messages less about how they wanted to kill you and more just about the sort of creative ways in which they wanted you to die. At one point, some of my research was discussed on Alex Jones's InfoWars, which led to an increase in videos about me and my research on explicitly white supremacist, alt-right, and Nazi YouTube channels. And this is some of the results of that. There's a lot of speculation about, whether I was Jewish, whether I was a race traitor. It sort of switched to that tact instead of whether I was a real gamer, whether I played games. It was a very obvious shift. Going back to the bigger picture, in 2017, Zoe Quinn writes Crash Override, a book about their experiences and what we can do about internet harassment at large. They start the book by saying, quote, "For the past 3 years, I've watched my breakup story told and retold by everyone from the writers of Law and Order SVU to President Trump's chief strategist. It had a Wikipedia page, it spawned in-jokes and internet slang, and had dedicated community hubs. It has a cartoon mascot. My breakup required the intervention of the United Nations." And I think that really sums up Gamergate and that time period quite nicely. And if you haven't read this book yet, I really recommend it. I should also say that in 2017, Quinn also wrote about the overwhelming pressure of being held up as an exemplar of women in games when they don't actually identify as a woman at all, which is another complicated aspect of that time. In recent years, we frequently see a policing of what women can look like in a game, as we see here in the sort of racist reaction to the new God of War game. In 2019, employees at Riot walked out in protest of their sexist work environments, and in the end, Riot Games was forced to pay out at least $10 million to women who worked at the company over the course of 5 years. And Activision Blizzard has had similar problems, and they are currently being sued for issues such as male staff behaving inappropriately towards women and making rape jokes in the workplace. Essentially, this is just the beginning of confronting the games industry's rampant issues with sexual assault and sexual harassment. I want to finish on a positive note. In 2021, Anita Sarkeesian launched the Games and Harassment Hotline with the help of long-standing crisis hotline experts. So this was a much-needed community. This was very needed in our community, as there had been nothing since Zoe Quinn's Crash Override network was disbanded in 2018. The Games and Harassment Hotline is an invaluable resource for everyone in games and a great example of how we can focus our energy in supporting and uplifting each other until the industry and larger culture is willing to change. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Emma, for your insights and your research. That was really interesting. We're now going to move on to the panel part of the discussion. We're going to start with some questions compiled previously, and then we're going to move on to audience Q&A. So for audience members, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in WebEx, and we will go through them in the second half of the panel. Okay, so this first question I'm going to direct to all of the panel members. Based on your experience and research, why is misogyny and homophobia in gaming an important and relevant topic? You can feel free to raise your hand, anyone who feels like going first.
I'll go
Let's see.
first, I guess. Didn't know if that was the digital hand or the real hand. But in my research, I'm looking at games as cultural products. And I believe that games, which are a huge, massive industry, are texts which both reflect and shape social attitudes, particularly towards women, towards other marginalized groups. I think that the ideological messages that these games are encoded with, that they are imprinted with the ideals of the environment they're produced in, these messages aren't isolated to just a gaming bubble. They're absorbed by the people who play them, and then those people bring those attitudes and those beliefs out into the real world. So I think it's really important to examine what messages these games are sending and what effects they're having on the people who play them, both men and women, marginalized groups, and others. So that's where I'm coming from.
So yeah, Shanna and I can go next. Sorry, I've grouped Shanna and I together just because so much of our work is together, but I can go and then Shanna, you can absolutely jump in whenever. So like I said before, my research is concerned with how feminist digital artifacts, ideas, and stories are moving through different contexts, and how these are always constrained and enabled by power. And gaming is all three of these things. Their games offer us artifacts or things that we can analyze. They're drawing on both dominant and subversive ideologies to shape narratives, and they're telling us these stories about the world around us. So when misogyny and homophobia are both clear themes in a game and are also the effects of the game, then it's telling us, like Lindsay was saying, it's telling us that misogyny and homophobia are clear themes in the world around us. And so to this point, I also want to add that we can't talk about misogyny and homophobia without also talking about other intersecting power structures like white supremacy and racism, like transphobia and queerphobia largely, and also like ableism and capitalism and others. So if we're thinking about these systems of power in games or in other aspects of digital culture, we should always be asking as well, like who benefits from this game? Who's harmed in this game? And then what are the effects of the game for both players and the larger culture? And so the research that Shanna and I do like looks at these kinds of questions within digital culture at large. And Shanna, do you want to jump in?
I think honestly, just to echo what's been said, we study this because misogyny and homophobia and everything else that Brie has noted in there, in gaming is tied to misogyny, homophobia, white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, cis heteropatriarchy, in all aspects of digital online culture, as well as offline cultures, including pop culture and entertainment. And so because these are all connected, I think it's really vital that we name and track these things and to understand how they operate, how they came to be, what larger kind of histories and systems of power they're tied into, which I think, Emma, you did such a great job with your overview of 20 slides. I learned so much in that. And then what are the consequences of this, which is hopefully what we can talk a little bit about today. And then I guess once we can name all of that and understand that, we have a standing chance of maybe fighting back. But we have to know it before we can push against it.
Emma?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to that that a lot of my research about games culture is really informed by Dr. Kashona Gray's research, which looks at ideas of deviance. And I think that games culture is very interesting because people will often ask me, like, why is games culture so much worse than everywhere else? And I think the thing is I don't think games culture is more homophobic or more sexist. I think that it's just not seen as deviant within that culture to be homophobic, to be sexist, to be racist. In fact, it's seen as quite deviant to stand up against homophobia, sexism, and racism in that culture. So I think for me, one of the reasons why it's so relevant is because I think a little bit of what we see in the gaming community is like the true face of our society. Like we see what people are really thinking and how people are really processing art and media and culture and industry, almost gloves off, because it's that people aren't afraid to say what they really think because it's not considered deviant in that culture. And I think that's why it's such an important place to study and to intervene.
That's really interesting. So you're saying in gaming culture, it's sort of like the community is saying what is on the minds of other people in other communities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of why people will often say, oh, Gamergate or something else, it was the canary in the coal mine for something else that happened. And I think that's true to an extent, but I think in reality, it's just that you saw in games what you couldn't see in other parts of culture, if that makes sense.
You can't ignore it if it's that explicit, I suppose. So moving on to a more specific question, this one I'm going to direct at Lindsay. So public backlash to queer characters by the gaming community is something that we've seen in recent years, for example, Ellie in The Last of Us. Can you speak a bit about how this affects queer gamers and the gaming community at large?
Well, the representation of queer people in games is not particularly what I'm focused on. But for example, I haven't actually played The Last of Us, which I know I should have, but there are a lot of games I should have played. But I think that there is always going to be a backlash. No, I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry, I'm just collecting my thoughts here. I think that the effects of this backlash on queer gamers are to feel unwelcome in a space that already feels incredibly unwelcoming. When we do see a game that gives us that thrill of, oh, I'm there, look, there I am. And then there is an avalanche of hatred saying, no, this is ridiculous. You don't belong in this game. Then it can feel defeating. It can feel incredibly painful. It can feel like it's pushing us out. I'm thinking of my own experience. So seeing Aloy in Horizon Zero Dawn, this amazing female main character who isn't sexualized, who is very cool and very powerful. And then I log on to Steam to see the game mods. The second most popular mod of all time is a game which removes all of her clothing, except for I think a couple strings. That's called the Sexy Outfits mod. And then the third most popular mod of all time is a mod that makes her face prettier. It thins her nose, it thins her cheeks, it takes away her freckles. And the saddest thing is, this is exactly what I had expected to find when I went to the mod page. I knew that this is exactly what the gamers who program mods would want to do to this game, to sort of take away that representation, take away that power, and put Aloy back in her place, I guess. So that's more, I'm relating that to my personal experience, but I think the effects are pretty universal amongst people who experience this, as well as being particular to their own, experience as well.
Of course, yeah. And what you said about the mod sort of altering players' faces, that really reminds me of Snapchat filters and other filters we see that do that same thing, like on users' faces as well.
And and it's always a very particular, by prettier, they mean more in line with a beauty standard that's very much based in the white features, this sort of the normative beauty isn't one that includes women of color. It isn't one that includes Indigenous women. It's a very specific, very homogenous sort of look. The filters are all going for a single face, and the closer you can get to that face, the more beautiful you are, right? And that's the kind of thing I see in these mods, and it's just depressing that it's making everything, it's removing any sort of character, any sort of heterogeneity, any sort of diversity of beauty, and it's all very depressing.
Yes, yeah, of course. Speaking more directly to your research, how have you found that sex workers in games tend to be objectified or treated by games?
There's there's a bit of dissonance. I found that a lot of the narratives of games make a serious attempt to give women in prostitution agency. I'm thinking of Assassin's Creed, in which these women are frequently big players in the political behind the scenes, right? And then in the mechanics of the game, the procedures, they're resources for the player in many different ways. And visually, I'm thinking specifically of The Witcher 3, in which they call them strumpets, are visually marked out in such a way as to look absurd. So The Witcher 3, I don't know if it's going for a sort of vaguely medievalist aesthetic, right? Sort of Polish, but, could be European. But the prostituted women walking around are in costumes that go beyond anachronistic. They're wearing hot pants and strange looking blouses, and they look completely out of sync with the setting. They're being visually set apart and marked and sexualized in a way that doesn't even fit the tone of the game. It's just so gratuitous and so strange, I've found. So that's sort of an example of the weird dissonance between the narrative and the actual mechanics and the visuals that I've found. But again, my research is early stages, so.
Right, yeah. Speaking about sort of trends that we see in the representation of certain groups and harmful tropes and storylines, we see sort of damsels in distress and women in the refrigerator trope in games and in digital culture in large. I'm wondering if this sort of like the effects of these tropes is something that Brianna and Shanna can speak to a bit next. And
Sure,
Emma
definitely.
wants to hop in.
Yeah, because I would also love to hear Emma's perspective as well after. Because so Shanna and I we take kind of more macro approach to this, kind of thinking about the networks that are involved that make this kind of stereotype possible. So for example, like feminists and other critical thinkers have been saying that we need to look at both the social and the technical and the visual aspects of a game. So in part, this might bring us to the question of who actually gets to make games and who's allowed to actually be at the table here. And so this is kind of reflecting larger social and political structures that many would see as outside of a game, but are actually very much infusing what we're seeing in a particular game. So who do we think is actually creating the trope of the damsel in distress? Who is actually at the table allowed to think of these ideas. So the trope of women in the refrigerator, for example, is just another manifestation of rape culture that we see. And because we live in a rape culture, violence against women is going to be normalized in these ways, which is why we're seeing the kinds of clothing that Lindsay is describing. And so like these stereotypes are not new, but they do manifest in different ways. And Gail Simone actually, she's got a website from 1999 that's talking about where and how these tropes manifest. So like 1999, I mean, for me, it doesn't feel that long ago, but I know that sounds like a million years ago. But so we know it's been here for a long time, and showing us like where it really started, which I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, was a Green Lantern comic that like sparked that name. Yeah. And so then like in terms of public backlash, I think a lot of us who are really invested in like feminist technoscience, social technical aspects, like we are seeing that every feminist or what is perceived to be feminist happening has this really equal and violent misogynistic reaction. And so from my research, I'm seeing it in networked movements like Me Too and Time's Up. There's really incredibly vitriolic responses, and Gamergate's another example of that super misogynistic response. And so like sadly, it shouldn't like surprise us that there is this public backlash to queer characters because of this struggle to control media spaces, which dominate groups believe that they own and are owed. So like, for example, I'm thinking about, I guess, spoiler alerts for people who haven't seen Eternals. There's a gay kiss. I'm sure many people have heard about it. And that is now banned in 3 countries. And so it means that this event doesn't really have the opportunity to be talked about, to actually be opposed in public culture. So in this instance, there's actually no struggle for space because the space is not allowed. So within games, we can think, what does the struggle for control of boundaries of space look like? Gamergate being one example of that kind of struggle for control. And so, like Emma was saying before, these kind of public backlashes make visible to the wider public the kinds of sentiments and struggles that queer folks and women have always been encountering kind of behind the scenes. And so for people who are racialized and queer and women, this is worse. So I just talked a lot, and so I'll let the others also jump in.
Emma, are you okay if I hop in for 1 second, give the long view of history? And then, okay. So I know Bree is, so as someone who's old, 1999 is not that far away. I'm going to take us back to the beginning of cinema history because all of these tropes actually exist from literally the beginning of cinema. So we can say, 1895 if we want to make a location, but more specifically with the rise of classical Hollywood, I'll say 1920. And so things like, the woman in the refrigerator, these are always ways in which women's precarity, either by the threat of rape or violence, or they become the femme fatale who's going to ruin the man. These are the ways in which women act as object figures for a narrative for a male protagonist's narrative to go forward. And so there's no way within the history of classical Hollywood or cinema to this point that women could be the driving force of a narrative. So in 1975, Laura Mulvey writes the most important article ever called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, where she talks about this way in which women's position within representation is an object to be looked at. So this to be looked atness. And the fact is that hasn't changed from 1895 to 1975 to Instagram now, and the way in which we position ourselves or femme presenting women present themselves, to the game industry. So that's there. And I think that Bree is absolutely accurate to tie it into like the kind of flows of rape culture. And so this is a representational trope. All of them, damsels in distress, women in refrigerators, all of them are representational tropes that are tied together. And so one thing that I will put in here, since we are going into very depressing territory, is that also there's always been a way in which people have pushed back. And I'm going to keep coming back to this. Women have, and people who have been marginalized within representation are always going to be creating their own visual forms to push back. So you can see this in like the unicorn, Team Unicorn. I'm so excited to learn about that with their parody videos. You can see that with the history of any kind of feminist cinema. You can see that in indie games. There's always pushback, but also as audience members, we also get to decide how we are going to engage with what is being pushed into our faces. And so we can do oppositional or negotiated readings. We can kind of be critical of the media we love. I think that comes from Sarkeesian, does it not? Yeah. So I think that we have to see both sides of that and find the ways in which we can have agency and power within this kind of onslaught of absolutely negative representation. And hopefully in 2021, we're seeing, at least within Hollywood, a move towards more people at the creative table who are from marginalized positions, who are going to make sure that the narratives do change. It's not always the case, especially when we talk about queer representation and pretty much killing the lesbian couple or killing the gay couple or pathologizing the gay person as the person with mental health issues or being the sociopath. Like there is a long history of really problematic things going on, specifically with queer characters. Hopefully we're going to see that changing. And one of the main ways that changes is in how we vote with our dollars. What do you buy? What do you watch? What do you play? How are you going to push back? It's a small way to change cultural conversation, but when we impact with how we use our funds and how much money they're making, that makes a big difference. So go and support all the people who are doing it right. Okay, Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Shanna. I mean, that's so funny that you went to feminist film history because that was exactly where I was going to go. One thing I always tell my students when I've really changed the way that I teach Gamergate, I now try to teach it as a contextualized like moment in games history, not as the most important thing that ever happened in games history, because I think it's important for them to know that it was just a manifestation of something that existed before and still exists after. And one of the things I always bring up is the history of film and how the things that Sarkeesian was critiquing, the tropes that Sarkeesian was critiquing in her videos were tropes that had been critiqued in film and television, in the 70s and 80s for years and years. So, not to say anything negative about what Sarkeesian was doing, it was clearly foundational work, but it was these very simple feminist critiques that had already been made, that were getting this huge, massive reaction to them because games just wasn't ready to hear those critiques that film had heard so long before. And to go back even further again in history, I have an article that came out recently called "There and Back Again." Oh no, I can't remember the subtitle. Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien and the History of Exclusion or something like that. And it looks at the sort of tropes of fantasy literature and how fantasy literature became fantasy tabletop games and how fantasy tabletop games became fantasy video games. And looking at how essentially a lot of things that are being made today are not any more progressive than fantasy works that were being put out 100 years ago. Because if you attempt to make something more progressive, there's this backlash that it's not historically accurate, or it's not really fantasy, or, in the case of the God of War image I showed, people saying, well, you can't have a black person, that doesn't align with Norse myth, or people saying you can't have female soldiers. When in reality it's like, okay, there's dragons, it doesn't matter. But people only use the concept of historical accuracy to uphold white supremacy, to uphold sexism, to uphold homophobia. They never use it to uphold anything else. So it's really just an excuse. And so I think a lot of those tropes get forwarded because people hold this idea like, oh, I can't have female soldiers in my game because that wouldn't be accurate to society, even though my game is set 40 years in the future in space. And that's something that we keep seeing over and over again. So I think that there's a long history in why these tropes keep getting repeated. And I think that people who are doing the repetition partly don't even realize it because they didn't get the education about undoing those tropes that we did. And that's what I hope I impart on my game design and development students now when I'm teaching them.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Emma, if that's okay? Sorry. I think it's important because you're saying, so this is something that I want to think about. So one place that I'm noticing that there is a really good pushback on representation is in YA fantasy, particularly written by women, and graphic novels for people around the ages of probably 9 to 16. So I'm seeing like amazing representational leaps happening in both of those spaces. And it's because I'm part of those fandoms that I kind of am tied into what's happening there. Do you think that there's any equivalent within game production right now? Are there like things that are mirroring things like Lumberjanes and Witch Boy and like all these really great kind of queer, positive, and bi narratives coming out of YA spaces that are being published by major, kind of production houses and are being read really, like, do you think that that's going to cross over into game spaces?
I mean, that's like the perfect question to ask me because not only do I love independent games, but also I have a bookstagram. I love reading YA fantasy and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's the diversification of that field is happening very fast. And I do think the main difference between graphic novels and games is issues of access and these long-standing issues of women and girls and women having access to leisure time, having access to technology, having access to computers, having access to funds. Everyone has a laptop now. So writing a novel, it's like you have access to the materials you need to do that. Having access to the materials and education you need to make a game is something entirely different, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Like, I think that Nina Freeman is a fantastic example of an independent female game designer who is making these games that sort of push back against the norm. And these small indie games, Nina Freeman's Sibel, for example, is the perfect example of a game that's actually about misogyny in games culture, but it's you playing through it. And so, one of my friends, Emily Flynn Jones, is making an amazing game right now called Curses, which is about a queer witch. Sort of it's like a YA story in and of itself, but it's a game. So I think that pushback is definitely happening, but the reason why we're not seeing it is happening as quickly as in other fields is because of these issues of access and of education. Games development education is just really not accessible to women, and games aren't accessible to girls in the step before that. So I think that that's coming, but those barriers to access have to be removed for it to happen at the intensity that it's happening in the comics field. And I also used to study comics before I studied games, so I know that that wasn't even true 10 years ago. A lot has changed in the past 10 years in that field as well.
That's another follow-up question to this discussion. A lot of you have mentioned how the creators of games and like how they're an important sort of like piece in upholding harmful tropes and harmful things that like resonate like throughout gaming culture. I'm wondering how much on the other side of things, the expectation of the consumers of games as being men and being straight and being white perhaps also plays a role in the continuation of harmful tropes within games. I'm sorry, Lindsay, did you want to go?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't address that to anyone.
I didn't know. Yeah, I think that there is, even though the numbers show that more women play games, more women are gamers, I think, at this point than men are. There's still the expectation that the real audience, the hardcore audience, the audience that's going to spend thousands on gaming rigs and invest a huge amount of money, is male, whereas the silly women are just playing Candy Crush or whatever. And I think I see that most reflected in advertising. The idea that sex sells is still such a thing. I scroll past ads for games that feature the exact bikini armor that you mentioned in your question there, with these incredibly buxom sexualized women, and then you see a shot of gameplay and it's top-down tower defense with no recognizable human characters whatsoever. So it's just using women's bodies to sell, and then that sort of selling, that sort of making sure that your product is sexualized is going to drive away, I find, a lot of women consumers who are turned off by that sort of thing. So it becomes, I think, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I believe that there is a study done showing that sexualized game covers did end up selling better, but didn't affect critical reception. But another study that I recently read, which was a ray of hope, showed that sexualized representation of women in games had actually gone down between 2006 and 2014. And they speculated it was because there was a growing awareness that women are actually in the gaming sphere, that we enjoy playing games, that our choices are frequently guided towards games that don't sexualize women because we enjoy not seeing women sexualized in games. So I think that there is a growing awareness that maybe women do enjoy games, and that this sort of male as default consumer idea is being challenged, and I think is going to go away soon. I hope, because I hope. Although those mobile ads are really funny, I enjoy seeing them just to laugh at them. But sorry, I lost the track of what the question was there.
No worries. I kind of know what you mean by the mobile ads being kind of nice. They're one of like the most consistent things about being on the internet that
They're
exists.
everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere.
Emma?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the ad that you're referring to, Lindsay, is the Game of War ads with Kate Upton.
Oh yeah, that was definitely one of them. That was a TV ad, I
Yeah.
think.
So,
Yeah.
because I did a bit of research into that, and they spent $40 million on that advertising campaign, and it is it looks like Game of Thrones, the advertisement, and it's got Kate Upton with her boobs out. And then the game itself, which they only show, at the very end of the advertisement on a phone, taking up 1/8 of the screen, is like a top-down RTS with microtransactions. And
Yeah.
it's interesting, when they sort of say like, oh, well, men are buying these gaming rigs, men are buying these consoles, and women are playing, like, that's a phone game, you know? And so much money right now in the games industry is in mobile games, is in live ops games, is in these games that were traditionally seen as women's games, or you know, games that men wouldn't dare to play. But that's where they're investing some of this marketing money now. So I think that there's basically a disconnect that's happening between you know, the people who are physically making the game are not the people who are in charge of the marketing. They're not the producers who are in charge of what actually happens at the end of the day. So even if you get someone making the game who says, well, like, I don't want my game to be sold or marketed with sexism, at the end of the day, they probably don't have any control over that. And I think that's something we're seeing a lot of right now.
Mm-hmm.
This is like totally like a side remark to that, but like to this point of gendered advertising. With my students just last week, we were looking at the Michael B. Jordan ad from who was like advertising Alexa from the football game, to be like, look how quickly this has shifted from being like Alexa's a disembodied female voice to, ooh, let's bring sexy Michael B. Jordan into this. And so I just wonder how long it'll take for this to show up in games as well. It's bad to say, but I'm like, I didn't hate seeing Michael B. Jordan on my screen. But I'm like, you targeted me, you saw me, and you marketed to me something that I would say, no, I don't want it. So it's also super easy to fall into these marketing schemes, truthfully, when we are not
Mm-hmm.
able to like have the literacy skills to be critical of the media that we love.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I guess speaking about ways that the ways that games are being marketed can be more inclusive, and the way that games being created can be more inclusive. What are some potential strategies or opportunities that can be leveraged to sort of increase that diversity and have it be meaningful and helpful, both like on the development side and also for the experiences of people playing games? I can rephrase that if I.
No, I'm just waiting for Emma and Lindsay to come in as the experts, and then I'm happy to follow up after that.
Sure.
In regards to, I'm not so sure about the development, but in regards to media literacy and marketing, I really try and convince every woman I know to turn off ad block, to turn off as many data tracking options on their phone as they can, to try and make yourself so that you're not constantly inundated by ads in as much as possible, because I found that it works remarkably well to improve my own image of myself, my own self-esteem, and my own focus on healthy priorities when I'm not constantly inundated by a stream of this. So learning about games, I find through word of mouth networks is the best way to find good games that sort of have the representation that speaks to me. So I think strengthening those interwomen, those communities of gamers who have similar priorities, who can stumble across games and share them, strengthening and maybe even formalizing those networks would be a great way to sort of get around the marketing industry that is trying to tell us which games belong to us, right?
I do think to an extent too, it's an issue of discoverability. You know, I have female friends who, as adults, have gone back to playing games because they went through that phase as teens where they were told, like, okay, games aren't for me anymore, and they stopped. And if they didn't have a friend like me who was like, hey, how about you try playing Night in the Woods? How about you try playing Life is Strange? How about you try playing Pikmin? They wouldn't be able to locate the games that they really enjoy, that they really want to play, because those aren't the games that are being advertised to them. The games you see advertisements for are these, you know, like we just talked about, the Kate Upton advertisement. Although I do think that is changing slowly because YouTube advertisements are so intensely targeted that now I'll find like, oh, I got a YouTube ad for Metroid Dread, like a game I would actually play. Whereas not that long ago, the idea of me getting an ad for a game I would play was like impossible to imagine, even though I play such a huge diversity of games. So I think that for a lot of women who wouldn't consider themselves interested in games, it's like they don't even know the existence of the sorts of games that they would enjoy playing. You know, a lot of like, I think Life is Strange is such a perfect example. I don't know a woman who I don't think would enjoy playing like the new Life is Strange game, but I'm sure that a lot of the women I know don't know it exists, you know?
Like such a good point, because I thought I didn't like games until I played Life is Strange. And then I was like, I do. I really do. So it's like it's funny that you picked that example, because out of all of the games that I was like, this is what changed my trajectory, it was Life is Strange.
It's
And
the
I think
perfect
what's great
example.
about, sorry, you know, it was a perfect example, because I also think that it's got such great themes interwoven into it of queer relationships, of mental health, and it does a really great job of bringing those together. Um, so literally last weekend, I was like sitting in the other room being like, let's play Life is Strange, which is not a thing I would have said 5 years ago. That's awesome.
Emma, it's so funny that you mentioned that phase of stopping playing games for a long time, because that's exactly what I went through. I loved playing games when I was a kid, but the boys, my brother, you know, the boys at babysitting always hogged the console, so I never got to play. And then for what, 15 years, I didn't touch games because they weren't really for me, except for The Sims. Um, when I actually got into gaming, it was because my then boyfriend had a console and I played Assassin's Creed because I wanted to walk around Venice, and discovered that I really, really am vicious and I love stabbing virtual people through the ear with a hidden blade. I think it revealed something very dark in me. So I got super into those big AAA, you know, boys club RPG games that I don't think would ever have been marketed to me, that I wouldn't have thought I could pick up and actually figure out how to play, because I just had no conception that that was something I would be into. But what you said resonated with me. You're friends with that phase, because that was my phase, and now I'm obsessed.
Yeah, like essentially research shows that around the age of 12 is
Hmm.
when the gatekeeping and the policing starts. So girls can have essentially two reactions in that phase. They can have the one reaction, which is like, well, screw you, I'm going to keep doing this and deal with the hatred that they're going to encounter every step of the way. Or they can sort of pivot and say, okay, I'm going to find a fandom that actually appreciates me, that actually wants me. Um, and most girls obviously take that second path, and who can blame them? Like my teenage years were hell because I chose the first path. I don't recommend it. But that's like, how then do you end up in the games industry if you've taken that second path? Because there is so much sexual harassment and hatred that you're going to deal with if you take that first path. So then I think a lot of women only come back to games as adults, you know, through either a friend or a boyfriend or a husband or something, because they were forced into that second path essentially.
I think that says something so important about the value of like networked fandoms as support systems and community building spaces for young women. So in any kind of capacity, whether it be gaming or reading or anything. And you know, it makes me think of how if we make social media the best part of the internet, which it pretty much never is, but if we do use it as that, we can think about how we can remove barriers to access by like support networks, but also by amplifying the kinds of games that you're talking about. So I like had to write that game down, so I'm gonna go check it out this weekend. Thank you, because I feel very alienated from game spaces. But now I'm like, well, if you said it's good, I believe you all. And then you know, like yeah, so like for me, any kind of community space that we can provide is important. It makes me think about like what it meant. So like Emma, for you, it was finding those fandoms. For me, it was being in zine culture as a young girl, which you know, teenage years were hell for all of us, I think. And like having that was so important because it was a counterculture that I could sort of sit within and work through all of those things. And so yeah, I think finding the ways to continue fostering those networked fandom spaces for people who are being alienated by the gaming community is probably really, really vital.
So I'm curious, now that we're on the topic of sort of creating spaces where gamers who can feel safe and appreciated and learn about games that might be more towards their interests than the ones that are marketed more broadly, what are some examples of spaces like that exist? And if there aren't a lot, what are some things that people within the gaming community can do to help foster those spaces, both online and or in person?
I will confess that I'm not a games community person. I'm a lone wolf gamer. I think Coate talked about the 5 different strategies that women in these spaces use to cope. Something like avoiding strangers or camouflaging themselves, emphasizing their skill to an extreme level, assuming aggressive personas to deal with it. But the strategy that I use is just withdrawing, leaving the online spaces that make me feel uncomfortable, which is sad, but I enjoy my one-person games. I enjoy retreating from the world to enter into a story. And I'll choose one single-person games that have a story that makes me feel comfortable within it. So being selective in the games I choose, watching streamers who experience the game so I can get an idea of whether that'll be a game that's a comforting space for me. So I know that doesn't actually help with how to create communities, because I confess that I have no idea how to create safe communities, because my coping mechanism was to just not enter into them, to create my own little gaming bubble that's sort of unaffected by other people. We're the worst part of gaming sometimes, but it can be the best. And I know I'm also missing out on those connections, right?
I think that what's important about what you're saying, though, is that there are so many different kinds of outcomes that we can get from gaming. For some, it might be community-based, but for others, like yourself, it might be these moments of solace to kind of like recover and then come back out to like live public life however you have to do it. And so I think those are like really important, like really feminist mechanisms for having to like navigate the world that we're in. So I don't think you should like feel ashamed for that or anything. I think it's really wonderful. But I do, the one thing that I do know is that there's a really great community in Toronto. Folks are in Toronto, which I'm sure Emma and Shannon know about, Dames Making Games, which is like such a fantastic organization. They are a not-for-profit organization, and they're like creating spaces for creators who are marginalized, so like by race, by gender, by sexuality, to actually like make, play, and also critique video games, which I think is super important. Like there's not often spaces for coming to like critique things we love, like Sarkeesian saying, right? And so Dames Making Games is a really great space for that. I also really like, it's not a secret archive, but it's a really great archive from Adrian Shaw. And it's available online. It's the LGBTQ video game archive, and it's offering a lot of info about queer content from the 1980s to the present. It's like lgbtqgamearchive.com, I think. It's very cool. I would definitely say that that's a good place to go as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, here in Toronto, there's Dames Making Games, there's the Hand and Eye Society. In Montreal, there's Pixels. A lot of those organizations are they're very based around female game creators, which is obviously important and people who need it. When back in the day, when I was a student at the GI, I used to run games nights, like gameplay nights, that were at first open for everyone, and then eventually for people who did not identify as cis men. And it was so interesting, because I think those spaces where you can come together and play comfortably, play with other people without fear, are so important. But one of the things I discovered over the years of running those events is that was so much easier said than done, right? It's something that's so complicated. So I think that there'll be a time where we can reach that point where we can have these events where women can game without fear or discomfort or stereotype threat. But we're not quite there yet. And I think that we are living through a time of great discomfort, sadly. But I do think one positive thing I want to say is that the leftist and anti-capitalist and progressive movement in gaming is absolutely exploding. The alt-right cut their teeth on Gamergate, but so did we. And so online, on Twitter, on Facebook, everywhere you go, you can find communities of progressive anti-capitalist gamers. And if you are someone who has no friends in games and you don't know where to go, I suggest seeking out those communities because they do exist. And I've seen people on the alt-right freak out like, oh, the communists, they've taken over gaming. I see that almost every day on Twitter now. So, you know, those progressive spaces are there and are growing because, you know, my students are 18 now, but that means when Gamergate happened, they were just young. Like, they've never not known the idea of feminism in games. Whereas for me, the idea of feminism in games when I was a teen was unthinkable. So I do think that we are, you know, riding the big uncomfortable wave of a big change currently as far as game spaces goes, big game communities.
So I was gonna say, I would just super love to take this moment to plug Emma and Gerald and Katana Gray's book, Feminisms in Play, that y'all should all check out because it's wonderful.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Maybe what platform is the best platform for finding those communities? So I know that for me, Instagram is a great place for the kinds of fandoms that I circulate in. I just simply put a hashtag in for whatever book I'm reading at that particular moment, and I fall into these spaces. Is it Instagram or is it Twitter for the anti-capitalist game spaces you're talking about?
I think there's some great closed Facebook groups, actually, as much as I hate Facebook. You know, I can't remember some of the names of the ones I'm in, but they're just called, you know, like leftist gaming group or whatever. But Twitter really is like at the forefront of the collectivized anti-capitalist movement, I think. And it's really interesting because you don't have these closed groups on Twitter, and hashtags aren't really used in the same way that they are on Instagram to collect people. So it really is, it's a sort of a snowball effect of following people. You know, you follow one person who's involved, and then you follow another, and then you follow another, and then you follow another. And so I think that over, you know, over the course of past 10 years, I've probably like found like, you know, my people on Twitter, like in the gaming community. But it took some time to find all those individual people. But yeah, I would say Twitter is definitely at the forefront of that, which is also, you know, a great place to get harassed. So there's not necessarily the greatest place to be either.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel like after this, we should distribute like a list of things that have been recommended, including like the games and stuff, because there's so many things I've been jotting down. I also wanted to remind audience members that you can submit questions in the Q&A panel, sort of like in the bottom right-hand corner. So please don't feel shy and submit questions. Actually, now I think I'm going to move on to an audience submitted question. This one's directed towards Emma. So what games did you focus on in your research? I heard you mention Blizzard and Riot. Did you research on other companies besides those? And what were your findings about the difference and similarities in misogyny in these different games / companies? And this was submitted by Ko Kien Zine. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name there.
Thanks for that question. So in my dissertation research, I was focusing a lot on games culture more so than any specific games themselves. So I do some close readings of games, talking about, like I mentioned before, about how those tropes are forwarded, fantasy games and that sort of thing. But a lot of my research has been talking about sort of these more events and more culture-based things, less than specific games. Mentioning, you know, the stuff that was discussed that I did bring up about Riot and Blizzard. I mean, it's interesting because I think that those are the two companies that get brought up because those are the two companies where everything has been brought to light. You know, everything has become very public because of the lawsuits. You know, also there has been similar stuff discussed at Ubisoft. But I do think that it's interesting because you sort of know, not through any official research channel, but just through knowing people who work in the games industry and knowing people who work in games, that I don't think people will say like, oh, Riot, like that's a really bad place to work, or oh, Blizzard, that's a really bad place to work, or oh, Ubisoft, that's a really bad place to work. But I don't think it's that at all. It's that every company in the games industry is part of the same culture and it all has the same cultural problems. It's just that those are the problems that we're aware of because their details are publicly available in the lawsuits. So I think that, I guess like with questions about different companies, I think, you know, all companies are sort of dealing with the same issues right now. And I think it's more of like a games culture issue than an issue that is located in specifically in any company, if that makes sense.
Thanks so much, Emma. So this next question is from Neil and has a follow-up as well. So this question is for everyone here, but I'd like to draw this away from the more game studies people amongst you if possible. So I think that means Brianna and Shanna. This question is, what kinds of representation would we like to see in games? The reason I ask is because of what I think of, well, pointless representation. In most games I play, you do the same things no matter what your avatar shows, and basically everyone is just a differently dressed version of the strong heroic person that kills things readily. How do we move towards doing actually different things if we're displayed as different avatars, particularly women in these games? Is there some hope that something non-basic heroic male could be more acceptable to, well, the masses? And again, that was asked by Neil.
Do you want to start?
So I love that this is directed at us, but I also feel like everyone can answer this question here. So let's open up the discussion. And I guess the one thing that I would contribute to this is that because I'm currently obsessed with Life is Strange, I do think like what we're seeing there is not this trope of male protagonist kills things and does it very violently, and the more violently you do it, the better. It is more of like, how do we explore a story together and explore really complex themes of mental health and of a bit of a trigger warning of suicide, right? How do we deal with these really complex things? And there's a whole other kind of like treasure trove of games that we might look at that aren't what we typically think of as a game that helps us do that. So I thought I heard someone else start to talk, but I will either Shanna, if you want to jump in, or Emma or Lindsay.
I mean, immediately, like, so I don't have a lot of experience with games, and maybe that's why you're asking. The only game that I really have a lot of experience with, which is not a lot, is this game that I bought my kids with these two little pieces of string that are tied together that have to like navigate a world. I forget what it's called. It was a pretty big deal, like game. Maybe somebody knows the name of it. I'm totally forgetting right now.
It's Unraveled.
Unravel. I love that game. So what's great about that game is that it's like really feel good. It's cooperative. It's kind of about engineering and physics. It's beautiful. So for me, I think aesthetics really matters in imagining new worlds. So I'm going to just pivot away and answer this question from the perspective of YA fantasy and graphic novels. What works there that I think could be applied elsewhere. And one of the things that really makes me super happy with some of the books that I read is where queer characters' life worlds are the norm. They're not exceptional and they're not plot points. They are just the norm. And when you allow for, say, a queer-centered narrative, if we were to imagine that in games, or a woman protagonist, or however, a non-male heroic protagonist as the lead driving the game, but you don't make it like a thing, then what that means is that we're imagining the possibility of new worlds without all that vexatious stuff that comes with it. So the history of like how it's been presented or represented in the past, any of those characters. And so, you know, if we could just allow that concept to lead a game and imagine a world otherwise in terms of aesthetics, I think that would be a really interesting interplay that could be possible. So just like, yeah, just having characters who just by default are not those things that we just named and are something else. And then just what does the world look like when what kind of relationalities are possible when that is the reality? And so I think about often a book that I love that I'll just plug to everybody called Witch Boy. It's a wonderful book that it's my son's favorite series. So it's geared towards 9 to 12-year-olds. And it's about a world wherein women are witches and in this family, and boys are shapeshifters, and it's about a boy who wants to be a witch. And so it's thinking about trans identity in this really great way where we're kind of thinking about the thing itself, but talking about it in these metaphorical ways that allow for a lot of openness and possibility. And so and then the space of the novel, or the graphic novel itself, is a space where most people in the space are mixed race. And so that's, again, defaulting away from whiteness, and it just becomes a normalized life world. And I think that's really has a lot of possibility.
And I think what's important about what you're saying there, Shanna, is that there's a lot of agency that people, in terms of agency, people see the player, usually the main player, as being the person who's got agency, but we also have to think about what a more distributed agency looks like, and also thinking about who is also, again, for me, it's like who creates these games, who is enabling these kinds of conversations to take place, who is at the table to be able to actually offer new ideas. Because if we only have one kind of person creating one kind of game, we miss out on this like really beautiful diversity of different kinds of ideas, different kinds of lives, different kinds of ways of being in the world that gets missed. And there are so many games that are doing that, but they don't get to be in the forefront of our public imaginary because of who kind of crafts these narratives around what we should and should not be playing.
And we know it's possible, right? Because we're seeing this happen, like in like, if you think about things like that show Cursed on Netflix, or even think about Bridgerton, like these ways in which we're decentering like these whiteness narratives of Regency era or medieval times. Like they don't have to be white spaces; they can be queer spaces with racialized folks in them. Like that is absolutely possible, and there's an appetite for that. There is a desire within consumer. Like we want to see that, and it does work. Like those shows work just fine, not even just fine. I mean, I'm a fan of them, so I'm gonna like step back and not just go into full geek mode. But yeah, so thank you. I want to add that. Like we don't have to have a medieval world that is completely the way it's been imagined before.
And I think this is what Emma was saying before, like I'm sure there weren't dragons. I'm so sorry to burst like bubbles, but like I don't think there were dragons. So if we can have dragons, we can have people who aren't just white.
So this next question isn't actually an audience question, but it connects to something that some of us at the Women's Center were discussing before this panel, and it's this concept of forced diversity being a complaint in gaming communities when sort of diversity is something that is brought into a game, and then the complaint is that it seems like forced and just to like cater to new audiences, and that being a negative. So how does this treatment of whiteness and cisness and straightness as the default play into this idea of forced diversity, and how can diversity as tokenism be avoided? Lindsay.
I love this question. One thing I noticed though is that your list of defaults, it doesn't include the most universal, the most invisible default of male, which is the universal male is, at the very roots and foundation of our society, along with all of these other defaults. Because that perspective is seen as universal, whereas women's perspective, even though we make up 50% of humanity, it's a niche perspective. It's an other perspective that, if it's included, is great, but really it's just a distraction from the universal. Just a little anecdote. I was playing, as I said, The Witcher 3, and I decided to sort of quantify the gender of the characters in the game. I went through the character list and I made a quick spreadsheet, and this is the character journal that lists all of the important characters. And as I was going through it, I was like, oh, wow, there are a lot of women here that Geralt gets to meet and get included in the journal. And then I did my little Excel formulas, and I found that there was 30% women. 30% of the characters were women. And scrolling through, I thought, oh, that's that's actually pretty good, right? Yeah, it's still 20% below what an accurate reflection of our society is, right? So I feel like what Brianna was talking about, getting getting a more diverse group of creators to sit at the table and to create games that reflect the world the way it is and the way they experience it, is an important thing, because until we get rid of that invisible default, until in the case of women, we're 50% of the characters, then games just aren't reflecting the world the way it is, and we can't begin to make equitable representations when it's not, when it's still defaulting to that male. So sorry, Emma.
I think that, just expanding on what Lindsay was saying, I think, and to go back to the question, this idea of forced diversity, which is something that comes up a lot, it's essentially it's a dog whistle, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
These sort of terms, I love to bring this up, but here I go. I have a tweet of mine that went viral that was pointing out that in the games community, everything that is not white, male, cis, heterosexual is considered political. And gamers will rally against anything that they consider political because they consider not just games, but all forms of entertainment apolitical. And you'll see this when people were talking about Dune, and they'll be like, oh, why did they make Dune political? And it's like, did you read this book? And so there is a huge pushback, not just in games, but in our entire culture against, quote unquote, forced diversity. But what it's really against is against acknowledging the politics of your existing worldview, right? If someone is white, they're seen as apolitical. If someone is heterosexual, they're seen as apolitical. If someone is male, they're seen as apolitical. And then the second, as with the God of War example that I included, that there's a Black female character, it's like, oh, well, this is trying to be woke, it's forced diversity, it's doing something political. And it's just like, but Black women do exist. So you're insisting that the existence of a Black woman is political, but the existence of a white man is not. But the existence of a white man in a game is political. It's just that the politics are white supremacy, and people don't want to acknowledge the existence of white supremacy because white supremacy is what's normal in our society. It's not abnormal. It's not, I talked earlier about ideas around, like what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, what's deviant. White supremacy is not deviant in our society. It's normal. And so then when there is anything that's trying to move beyond white supremacy, trying to move beyond misogyny, that's considered forced diversity. And I do think there's some examples where people have a bit of a point. I think something like Overwatch is, they have this incredible diverse cast of characters, and they have queer characters, and they have characters from, all different countries and all different backgrounds, but it's irrelevant to the game itself. All that narrative is told in these transmedia experiences, in these movies, in these comics. So the people who would get angry at you for having a gay character can still play Overwatch, and they don't have to actually interact with gayness. That gayness is behind this transmedia barrier. Or in some games, people will talk about the gay button. So any gay content is hidden behind you flirting with a certain character. So you don't actually have to encounter queerness in the game, even if there is queerness in the game. And I think that one of the barriers we need to move past is people do, a lot of times in games, this content is selective. Like you have to go seeking it out. You could play, to me, Life is Strange is an incredibly queer game, but you could play it straight, I guess, if you want, for some weird reason. So, but until that content is mandatory, people are going to see anything else as forced diversity because they've been allowed to opt out of playing the female shepherd in Mass Effect. They've been able to opt out of the queer storyline in Life is Strange. They've been able to opt out of interacting with people of color characters in a fantasy setting. So yeah, I guess that's what it comes down to, is this sort of the choice. There's so much choice in games, and that's actually making it worse in a weird way because, we say in Overwatch, there is this diversity that people can just ignore or not interact with, where it needs to be actually part of the narrative, part of the story, part of the game elements, part of the gameplay, and so on.
I think that what's really interesting about what you're saying too is that it almost does mimic how a lot of people can operate in the world. Like if up to this point they've been allowed to totally ignore basically everybody else who's around them, when they're suddenly confronted with it in a game, they feel like it's forced. And so I think that what's really important that both you and Lindsay brought up is that like we also just have to consider what's meant by forced diversity, because it implies that there is some sort of good diversity that isn't what we currently have, and that we couldn't possibly reach, even if that's not the intention. So like, because again of who gets to control the boundaries of space, which is often, you know, white cis straight dudes, if we're being honest, then like any shows of diversity, like you're both saying, are seen as forced when really they are just like emblematic of what the world around us looks like.
Yeah, and I think that's why the saying people of the global majority makes people so uncomfortable, because white people are not the majority of people on Earth, not even close. And this is something that I'm always emphasizing to my students is like, even my non-white students have this idea that white people are the majority. And so that is normal to see in your media, but it's just simply not true. So the idea that the majority of people in our media are white does not, like, people will be like, well, that's accurate. And it's like, it's actually not. It's just accurate to the weird worldview that you've inherited.
Yeah.
One strategy I was going to say that you made me think of, Emma, was to sort of trick gamers into choosing the more diverse option by making, or the more diverse, the more representative, is by making the default white male really bad and boring in games. But the other, I'm thinking particularly of Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
I was literally about to say Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Where the voice actress who plays Cassandra is outstanding, and the guy who plays what's his face, he sucked. So everyone picked Cassandra because it was the better game, and everyone loved Cassandra. I love Cassandra. She's the best. But no one was, well, there were some tantrums, but a lot of male gamers play through as Cassandra and experience the story from her perspective. And they're choosing to do it because hers is the better story, right? It's just a fun way to trick recalcitrant gamers into into choosing something different. Is a I think we should be implementing it. That's my new goal. Everyone should play Assassin's Creed Odyssey as Cassandra, by the way. She's great.
I mean, I think the fact that you forgot what the dude's name was just like is
I forgot. It's Alexios. He played he played the villain if you pick Cassandra. So like I interacted. He was just that bland. But Cassandra was, yeah. I won't go into it because it's just being a fan. But
awesome. Well, Assassin's Creed Cassandra, I feel like is getting added to the list of recommendations. So I guess, sorry, were you about to say something else? Okay, just making sure. We have another audience question. This one is from Agata. So this conversation about representation, visibility, and community in games and gaming seems to mirror conversations about women in STEM. Could some of the tools and approaches being deployed in that area to plug the hole through which girls leak out of the STEM pipeline? This wasn't given a specific panelist, so if anyone wants to jump in.
So I mean, I do have a thought, and then I'll like open it up again. But my first thought is just that like before we think about like plugging the holes in a pipeline, we have to think about what kind of culture we are creating that's going to actually support and encourage women, racialized people, queer people, anyone who's been marginalized by this like pretty terrible system to actually be able to thrive. And I think that's something that is currently lacking in a lot of spaces. There's a lot of talk about how do we get more people here, and not a lot of talk of how do we support them when they are here to be able to thrive. So that's something I would want us to consider more.
Yeah, just supporting what Bree just said. I think that there's been a lot of critique of the pipeline theory, and a lot of it focuses on the fact that there's all this focus on the pipeline and not what's at the end of the pipeline, which is a toxic pit. And so it's just like, oh, we got to ensure you get into our toxic pit faster and without leaking away, or without taking an alternative route where maybe you put on a hazmat suit first. And so I think that as someone who teaches game design development, and as someone whose students have ended up in the games industry, or in the tech industry at large, my focus has always been less on like, how do I get more of them there? And like, how do I properly prepare them for what it's going to be like there? You know, I think that a lot of people are just hoping that we can just like add marginalized people and stir, and it will fix all the problems within STEM or within the games industry. But most of the change that needs to happen from the people that are already there, and primarily the white men who are already there are the ones who need to make the most change, you know, to make their pit less toxic, instead of people coming into their toxic pit and being like, well, why don't you enjoy our toxic pit? Why don't you like getting farted on in meetings or whatever? So yeah, I think that's my thought about the pipeline approaches, is that I do think some of those pipeline solutions in STEM have worked, but I don't necessarily think them working has solved the larger problem. It's just sort of solved some of the smaller problems.
I like the way you framed that as changing it as an issue of women and other marginalized groups not joining an area that might not be hospitable to them, to changing the inhospitable, to changing like the negative attributes of that area, because then you're putting the onus on the people who have the power and are creating the negative outcomes. Yeah. So this next question says, do you think certain genres of games foster a more toxic or misogynistic environment for women that reproduce a system such as white supremacy and hate? Also, those that engage in these types of games, do you think this speaks more to the values and beliefs of the creators or users engaging in those games or environments? So I guess this is more game specific. So I don't know if Lindsay, you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's horrible, but my immediate thought is the worst environments in games for women are the ones where there are men in the environment with them. So MMOs, online FPSs, any game in which a woman has to enter into a community of other players and play with them, is so the game can be perfectly fine in itself, but then you add in the mix of this gamer culture, and suddenly it becomes an incredibly hostile place. So, and I think that many people who play MMOs and online games aren't toxic or misogynistic. And I think those who aren't, but who may be, for example, I have male friends who will go into voice chat and a woman shows up and other men in the voice chat start abusing her. The men who are engaging in these spaces and don't have these beliefs need to speak up in voice chat while it's happening, right? So that culture needs to be changed rather than the game itself. I can say certain genres of games do well to reproduce other sort of ideologies of domination. So I'll say there's a reason that 4X games are studied a lot in terms of colonialism and imperialism, because the mechanics lend themselves to expressing those sort of ideas. Military shooters are going to lend themselves really well to sort of spreading ideas of US exceptionalism, militarism, especially when they're actually funded by the military. I play a lot of games with no human representation, little games like Slipways, where you connect stars in certain patterns, or what was that, mini motorways, where you build the most optimum path between buildings for cars to flow. Sort of little abstracted strategy games that just give me a break from stuff, for example, I could go on about that's in The Witcher that's making me just feel attacked. Anyway, that's sort of my attempt at answering that one. But I think there are certain mechanics that are primed for expressing toxic beliefs. Absolutely. Like Neil was talking about the hero who goes out and kills everything. But I don't think that everyone who plays those games would support those beliefs.
Do you think that there's sort of a role for, even if players, like, even if the individual player doesn't support a white supremacist or racist or homophobic belief, if they're sort of being an active participant in communities that have sort of a just a joke attitude towards these harmful ideas, like that there's more of an onus on them to fight back against it, especially since, as you mentioned, people with feminine or accented voices tend to be more targeted in these online environments.
Yeah. I hate the it's just a joke. If it was a joke, I'd be laughing. But I don't appear to be, so I don't think it's actually funny. Sorry, maybe someone else had something they wanted to.
Yeah, I'll say this is something I cover with my students a lot, especially the use of racial slurs in games. Like recent studies have showed that the level of toxicity, especially racial toxicity in online games, has actually gotten worse, not better, in recent years. And I think that's in partly because people who don't enjoy that just stop playing, men and women alike. And you know, a lot of students, especially strangely non-white students, come in with the "it's just a joke" attitude towards racial slurs, which I think is a coping mechanism, right? It's a way of coping with you know, racism being in your face all the time, is to say, oh, it doesn't bother me, oh, it's just a joke. And one of the things that I talked about with a student recently, where they were saying like, oh yeah, my friends use the N word when they're playing games, but like they're not racist, they're friends with me, they don't mean it or whatever. And I said, well, if the person on the other end of that racial slur stops playing games, does it matter if it was intended to be racist or not? And that seemed to be the thing that got through to them, was not just is the person saying it racist, which, I mean, obviously it is a racist act, but it always comes back to like, well, I'm not racist, it's just a joke. But like, what is the end effect? Like, I have friends who are Black who stop playing games online because they are constantly bombarded with racial slurs. And it's like, if people who are Black or people who are women cannot play games online because of the intensity of harassment, it doesn't matter if it's a joke, if they stop playing. Like, you have made that environment toxic to those people, and you have taken that play experience, that leisure experience, away from someone for your joke, which is not funny and is indeed racist, whether you meant it to be or not.
Yeah, to kind of riff off of this just a joke thing, like there's a long history of framing like key concerns as just a joke to kind of prompt general publics, and specifically like survivors of abuse, to move on. So we see this a lot with rape culture, that there's this common trope of move on, let it go, get over it. And that works to promote shame and embarrassment and humiliation. And so it's really a gaslighting technique as well. It's an attempt to delegitimize the very valid concerns of people who are calling out and have experienced queerphobia, sexism, racism, and ableism in digital culture. And so, like, really, it's a way of maintaining the status quo.
I'm just going to add in from the original question too, that I think is really important, is it's asking like, is it the people making the game, or is it the audiences, you know, participating in this? And I think, you know, one way to look at this is like, we can, again, be critical of the media we love, and we can have what I call guilty pleasures. We can engage in things that are incredibly fraught. So I think about this in the types of movies I sometimes choose to watch, and the fact that during the holiday season, I watch a lot of W Network Hallmark movies, which are atrocious on every level and completely against all of my politics. And yet here I am watching them. And so I think that, you know, I think it's just really important that you understand what you're agreeing to get into, and have a criticality towards it. And if you are in spaces where you are seeing violence being perpetrated in terms of the discourse that's going on, don't be a bystander. Definitely stand up and do what you can. And I always talk about this with my students with regards to what I call digital blackface in memes and GIFs. And so the way in which we use either queer bodies or Black bodies in our GIFs and our memes as sites of very excessive emotion. And this is tied to a whole long-standing history that we could talk about what excess does in representation. I won't get into that, but I do ask my students to really think quite seriously about not the intentions, but the impacts when they use things that are positioning racialized or queer bodies as the butt of a joke, as the end point of a joke, and if it's actually worth it. And so I think that, again, just like being very critical about how you use, distribute, and engage in these things. We're going to be engaging in fraught media always. We can't avoid that at the moment. But what we do with it and how we interact with it and what conversations we let happen around it, I think really matter too.
Thank you so much, Shanna. That concept of digital blackface is something I've thought about a lot about recently, but I'd never heard that term given to it. So the next audience question comes from Sarita. What are some game recommendations, like Life is Strange, that would help get into gaming for someone who hasn't played since they were a kid?
I've got so many, but Lindsay, you could go first if you want.
I'm ashamed of half of my game recommendations that I would make because I play so many horrible, like big budget AAA games that I don't want to recommend. But, and it's not, Disco Elysium is the thing that everyone's been obsessed with for quite some time because the writing is just so good and fun, and you can be a full-on Marxist in it, and that really appealed to me personally. But try little strategy games if you like thinking. Like Into the Breach is a great little strategy game where one round takes I don't know, 20 minutes. You can play it in between pomodoros. And it's quite fun and quite simple, but also quite deep in the way it makes you think. Other ones, like I said, Mini Motorways I've been playing. Dorf Romantic is a very sort of peaceful, soothing, simple builder game. It's hard to explain, but it's beautiful. Sunless Skies is also one that I've been really into, where you sort of travel around on a top down. There's lots of reading and lots of really interesting writing going on in it. Those are the ones that are currently on my my desktop shortcuts. So I guess that's what I would recommend.
I feel like I want to make like some sort of like you know, like those like flow charts of like, because I feel like I have a lot of people come to me after they played the new Animal Crossing during the pandemic, people who would not have bought a Switch, who would not be playing games, but they bought a Switch to play Animal Crossing. And then they got sick of Animal Crossing and they came to me and they're like, Emma, what should I play next? And I feel like I need like a flow chart of being like, okay, if you want this, you go this way. If you want that, you go that way. But a few that I always recommend to people who are new to games and maybe don't have a lot of skill and are maybe self-conscious about not having a lot of skill are Night in the Woods, which is one of my favorite games of all time. Stardew Valley, which is a very accessible, I think, next step after people play Animal Crossing. Same with Cozy Grove, which is a game that I'm pretty sure is made here in Canada. That's another good step there. For someone who is more accustomed to mobile games, Grindstone is another Canadian game that's a sort of, it has some match 3 mechanics and some dungeon crawler mechanics, so it kind of combines those things. A Short Hike is another small Canadian game I always recommend people because you can play it in a single sitting, and it's just like a short emotional story. Life is Strange, like I mentioned before. Both Gone Home and Tacoma are two incredibly accessible ones. Also, don't require much skill. And then if you wanted something a little bit more intense but also accessible, I'd really recommend Hades, Boyfriend Dungeon, and The Outer Worlds, which is another sort of explicitly anti-capitalist game that I enjoyed recently. So yeah, I'll stop talking.
Oh, I have another thing that I thought of. When you're just getting into games, I'm sorry, top tip, don't be ashamed of putting the difficulty at the easiest setting. There is nothing wrong with that. Put it on easy, just enjoy the story. Like if you can go into God mode so that things aren't killing you, it's really fun. I mean, until you get used to the mechanics and want a challenge. I mean, when I play for research, I still put it on easy because I need to be focused on, what I'm doing rather than freaking out about being unable to hit a moving target, right? So don't at all be ashamed of putting on easy. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a great way to experience a game.
That reminds me, I always feel like your hobbies shouldn't be like super stressful, and playing a game on easy embodies that.
You're supposed to enjoy it. Like if you're not enjoying a game, there's no point in playing it really, is there? That's why I can't play MMOs either. Not just because of the community, but because within 20 minutes, I'm like, this is just work. I'm just working and not being paid for it. So, no, I'm good.
Okay, so one last audience question. If the gaming environment is one that harasses women or label them as unicorns, what aspects keep them from quitting gaming altogether or enacting their agency to fight these dominant mainstream ideologies? I'm going to direct this at Emma because I think it relates, at least at first, I think it relates to some of the things you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's such a great question and such a hard question to answer because I think it's different for everyone. So on a personal level, I'll just say that for me, like I grew up playing games. I didn't have any games, right? I had a brother. So the only reason I am sitting here today is because I had a brother. If I had a sister, there is zero chance I would be sitting in this room today. The only reason games were accessible to me, the only reason games culture was accessible to me, the only way the games industry was accessible to me is because my brother was born a boy. And I think that I played his games at an early age. We were both really interested in it, but I wasn't pushed in that career path in the way that he was. And around the age of 12, as I said before, it was definitely considered weird that I was still playing games. Like I had boys mad at me that I could beat them at 007. I had guy friends who would like call me Nintendo girl because it was like offensive and weird that I still played video games instead of like, I don't know, going and smoking and skateboarding or whatever they wanted to do. And in high school, having friends who played games meant that I was dealing with constant sexual harassment, and, constantly being talked down to. My high school friends played D&D and I literally was explicitly unallowed because I was female. And it wasn't until university that I found friends who played games who respected me. But it took until I was probably 21, 22, other than my brother, to make a single friend who also played games who respected me. But I think because I had that one positive experience, it allowed me to like, I guess it's just like, it's the games, right? Like I still loved games. And like, I became an English major. I loved books. I loved narratives. I loved television, but I loved games. And I think that's what kept me there. But I think a lot of women who do love games aren't kept there. They're driven out by that harassment or that toxicity. And I don't want to suggest like I love games more than they love games or anything like that, but I do think it's really like a testament to how much women want to be there and how much they've always been there, that they aren't just getting the fuck out because it's very, very tempting to do so. I'm not sure if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I think that what you're also like pointing to is like, so wait, sorry, let's back it up. Like we've been saying this whole time, there are these very clear parallels between game culture and other cultures and real life, if we're gonna like position it that way. And so if we're saying that women might have to leave games because it's so misogynistic and because there's so much harassment, what are we saying about like life in person where there's so much sexual harassment and misogyny and like terrible things happening to people all the time? And so it's like enacting agency is like something we can question here to say, enacting agency might not be that we leave. Enacting agency might be that we stay and that we speak back to the kinds of harassments that we're seeing happen. And I think that like a lot of the work that we're seeing from Emma and Lindsay is a really important testament to that.
And I would add into like, I'm thinking about this more from like a role player tabletop game because I play D&D. And so I think like my first experience with D&D were in high school. And the only reason I was allowed to play was because I was someone's girlfriend. But you know, as an adult, I play in a group with really, really supportive people of all genders. And so like having that kind of ally and kinship that allows for women to exist in these spaces is really important. So if you are in these spaces and you aren't femme presenting or a woman or whatever, make the space accessible in any way possible, and also make communities possible, make that community possibility exist. And if you are in those spaces and you are being marginalized, find your people and hold on to each other, because that's just a survival strategy for everybody within patriarchy, or any of the things that we live in. Find your people and hold tight and make community.
That's really beautiful. I lied earlier when I said there was one more audience question. There is another one, and we have about 5 minutes left, so hopefully we can answer it without going over. You touched on the importance of diversity in not only games, but game creators. With issues in the industry coming to light and a public awareness of an industry that's not very accepting, what do you think are some important factors for game dev companies and employees to ensure that people aren't dissuaded from approaching the field in the education and career selection, similar to how STEM has been attempting to deal with some of the same issues? I guess this echoes some of the women in STEM conversation we were having earlier.
I guess just to start off, it's hard because one of the things is at that educational level. I don't know how many students and friends I've heard stories from that they were told explicitly by their professors in STEM or game development or whatever else, like, you will not last, like, you will not get through this degree. And instead of trying to make the degree more accessible and more approachable, you have these professors who are like, this is, you're wasting my time, like, don't, by being here, like, don't even try. And it's truly unfortunate, because even if you have professors who are not like that in the program, if you have another professor who maybe has tenure or something else, who is purporting these ideas that women aren't as skilled, aren't as good, won't make it, then of course, no wonder women don't stay around. You know, I've seen game development programs, not the one I'm currently teaching in, which I love, but other ones, you know, be called out on the issues that they have with gender and with fairness and with sexual harassment and sexual assault, like at the undergraduate level, and them just be like, this is a lie, like, this doesn't exist, it's not real. And so I do think I think that a complete revamping of the way that these undergraduate programs are modeled and the culture within those programs is so important. And unfortunately, you know, there's going to be people in positions of power who don't want to make those changes. So I think that's such a hard question, because there's things that we can do, but it's those people in those positions of power who need to do the most, and so many of them are unwilling.
Or think they're like the good guy, which like is so tricky. Like, you have people like, I just feel like white feminism is like the poster child for this, being like, I'm doing such good work, why aren't you applauding me? And not realizing the ways that there's a lot of harms being enacted. So that was just my like little commentary from the side about what Emma already said.
Absolutely. Like, you know, in these examples where I've seen people be like, oh, our program's fine, it doesn't have any problem at all, it's often women in charge who are saying, like, there's no sexism here, there's no racism here. And it's these white feminists who are unwilling to see any of the issues. And then also people are like, well, if a woman's saying it, it must be true. And that creates this like a whole other set of problems. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely why we need intersectionality to like totally attack these kinds of questions.
Awesome. Well, that was our final audience question. Thank you all so much for your insights and your answers. This has been a really interesting conversation. And I'd like to introduce Agata again to give us some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, everyone. This was an incredibly interesting conversation, and I kind of wish that I could force everyone that comes within the vicinity of the Games Institute to consider this required reading. But just to conclude, thank you very much for those of you who have joined us in the audience, and thank you for the engagement. I saw some moving emojis or whatever those things are, all called now because I'm old, I don't actually know. And thank you very much to the panelists for such personal and in-depth answers, and I really enjoyed and really appreciated how much of your thoughts were coming from your own experiences, because again, I think that humanizes the issue and makes us almost feel what you were saying. So thank you very much, and thank you to Goyoya for moderating the panel today, and to the other Women's Center volunteers that have been active today as moderators and support on the invisible back end. The other people who had helped, obviously, was our Games Institute administrative staff, in particular Anthony Ravindran, who set it up and play tested and all sorts of other things so that we could actually be here today. So thank you very much, Anthony. I will conclude with inviting the audience and obviously the panelists as well, and the Women's Center folks to keep tabs on what we're doing and what we're offering to the public, as well as to our own members. Emma, we didn't introduce her that way, but Emma is now working with the Games Institute, and she will be communicating a lot, I hope, of the research that is happening, not only from the humanities and game studies and such, but from the technical side as well, on the technology end. And so do look forward to a lot, hopefully, coming from Emma. No pressure there. Thank you so much. We are now at the end of our panel today. So feel free to disconnect. I know that I will remain behind in case there are any questions related to the Games Institute. And again, thank you very much to the panelists. I can see applause happening, and I will join in that. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy some of the sun that is still outside. Rumor has it we're gonna get like 10 centimeters of snow in about 2 weeks' time. So
Stop.
enjoy it
Wow.
while it lasts. Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Agata.
See you next time.